The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of courtroom 302 in the Boston Municipal Court, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Judge William Harrington adjusted his black robes as he settled into his large leather chair, his face wearing its usual stern expression. At 58 years old, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he had spent the last 15 years building a reputation as one of the strictest judges in the city. The courtroom buzzed with the usual morning activity. Lawyers shuffled papers, court officers stood at attention, and nervous defendants whispered to their attorneys. The judge's clerk, Mary Thompson, approached his bench with a stack of case files. "Your Honor, the first case this morning is regarding an unpermitted protest," Mary said quietly, placing the file in front of him. "The defendant is Sarah Mitchell." Judge Harrington nodded, his eyes already scanning the document. He had handled hundreds of protest cases before, and in his mind, they were all the same, troublemakers disturbing the peace. Case number 2024 CR 789, City of Boston versus Sarah Mitchell, the court officer announced loudly. The courtroom fell silent as Sarah Mitchell walked forward. She was a black woman in her mid-30s, dressed in a simple gray suit that looked professional but not expensive. Her natural hair was styled neatly, and she carried herself with unexpected confidence for someone facing charges. This caught Judge Harrington's attention briefly, but he quickly dismissed it. Sarah stood at the defendant's table alone, without a lawyer. This wasn't unusual for minor cases, but something about her calm demeanor seemed different from the usual nervous defendants who appeared before him. "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Harrington began, looking down at her over his reading glasses, "you are charged with organizing an unpermitted protest that blocked traffic on Washington Street last Tuesday afternoon. The police report states that your actions caused a 30-minute traffic jam and required police intervention. How you pled?" Sarah's voice was clear and steady as she responded, "Your Honor, while I acknowledge my presence at the protest, there are important details about this situation that I believe the court should hear." Judge Harrington felt a flash of irritation. In his experience, this was usually the beginning of a long explanation trying to justify breaking the law. He cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Ms. Mitchell, this is a simple matter. Did you or did you not organize a protest without proper permits?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of authority. "Your Honor, I did organize the gathering, but," Sarah began again. "Then I don't see what else needs to be discussed," Judge Harrington interrupted. His patience was already wearing thin, and it was only his first case of the day. The morning sunlight now fell directly on Sarah's face, highlighting her composed expression. She stood straight, her hands folded in front of her, showing no signs of the nervousness that Judge Harrington was used to seeing in his courtroom. Several people sat in the gallery behind Sarah, watching the proceedings intently. Judge Harrington noticed they seemed unusually interested in this simple protest case, but he attributed it to them probably being fellow protesters. "Ms. Mitchell, this court takes violations of city ordinances very seriously," he continued, shuffling the papers in front of him. "Unpermitted protests not only create chaos but also put public safety at risk. The police report clearly states that your actions disrupted traffic and required valuable police resources to be diverted from other duties." Sarah opened her mouth to speak again, but Judge Harrington raised his hand to silence her. He had already made up his mind. This was a straightforward case of someone breaking the law and trying to waste the court's time with excuses. "This court finds you in violation of City Ordinance 7.52 regarding unpermitted public gatherings," he pronounced, his voice echoing in the now silent courtroom. "You are hereby fined $5,000, to be paid within 30 days. A subtle murmur ran through the gallery, but Sarah's expression remained unchanged. She simply nodded, maintaining eye contact with the judge for a moment longer than he expected. "Next case," Judge Harrington called out, already reaching for the next file. As Sarah turned to leave, something about her dignified exit made Judge Harrington pause for a brief second. But he quickly pushed aside the strange feeling in his gut. After all, he had dozens more cases to hear today, and he had always prided himself on being efficient with the court's time. Little did he know that this brief morning encounter would soon turn his world upside down. Judge Harrington spent the rest of his morning handling routine cases, but something about Sarah Mitchell's case kept nagging at his thoughts. As he sat in his chambers during lunch break, eating the same turkey sandwich he brought every day for the past decade. His clerk Mary knocked on the door. "Come in," he called out, brushing crumbs from his black robe. Mary entered with a concerned look on her face. "Your Honor, there are several reporters outside asking about the Sarah Mitchell case from this morning. They seem quite interested in your decision." Judge Harrington frowned, putting down his sandwich. In 15 years on the bench, reporters had rarely shown interest in minor protest cases. "Tell them I don't comment on court decisions," he said firmly, wondering why this case was drawing attention. As Mary turned to leave, she hesitated at the door. "Sir, one of the court officers mentioned that some of the people in the gallery this morning were from the Veterans Rights Association. They seemed upset about the fine." The judge's frown deepened. Veterans Rights Association? What did they have to do with an unpermitted protest? He reached for the case file again, something he rarely did after making a decision. Reading through the police report more carefully this time, he noticed details he had overlooked earlier. The protest had taken place in front of the old Wilson building, which was currently being converted from a veterans' shelter into luxury apartments. According to the report, 57 veterans were facing immediate eviction. His stomach tightened slightly. He remembered his own father, a Vietnam veteran who had struggled with homelessness after returning from the war. But rules were rules, he told himself firmly. An unpermitted protest was still illegal, regardless of the cause. The afternoon session was about to begin when his phone buzzed with a text from his daughter, Rachel, a law student at Boston University. "Dad, did you really fine Sarah Mitchell $5,000 this morning? The whole law school is talking about it." Judge Harrington stared at his phone in confusion. Why would law students be discussing a simple protest case? Before he could respond, another message appeared. "She's literally in our textbooks, Dad. How did you not recognize her?" His hands felt suddenly cold as he opened his laptop and typed "Sarah Mitchell, lawyer" into the search bar. The results made his heart skip a beat. Sarah Mitchell's professional profile filled his screen. Harvard Law School graduate. Lead counsel in 3 Supreme Court cases. Recipient of multiple human rights awards. The woman he had dismissed so quickly that morning had argued and won more high-profile cases than most lawyers would in a lifetime. A video started playing automatically. Sarah giving a commencement speech at Yale Law School last year. She spoke about growing up in poverty, putting herself through law school while raising a younger sister, and dedicating her life to fighting for social justice. Judge Harrington loosened his collar, feeling uncomfortably warm. The Sarah Mitchell in the video was the same composed woman who had stood in his courtroom that morning, the same woman he hadn't allowed to explain her side of the story. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a link from Rachel to a local news website. The headline made his blood run cold. Celebrated civil rights lawyer fined $5,000 for protecting homeless veterans. A case of judicial bias. The article mentioned that Sarah Mitchell had been working pro bono to prevent the eviction of veterans, many of them elderly and disabled. The protest had been organized as a last resort after all legal channels had been exhausted. According to witnesses, the traffic disruption had lasted only 12 minutes, not 30 as stated in the police report. Judge Harrington sat back in his chair, his turkey sandwich forgotten. In his rush to maintain order and efficiency, had he failed to deliver true justice? The faces of the people in the gallery that morning came back to him, their disappointed looks, their quiet murmurs. They weren't just random protesters. They were veterans fighting for their homes. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Mary stood at the door again, looking uncomfortable. "Sir, the afternoon session is about to begin, and there are more reporters outside. They're asking if you were aware of Ms. Mitchell's background when you made your decision." Judge Harrington stood up slowly, his movements heavy with the weight of realization. For the first time in 15 years, he wondered if his reputation for being strict had turned into something else, a blindness to the human stories behind each case. As he prepared to return to the courtroom, he knew this day was far from over. The simple morning case that he had dismissed so quickly was about to become one of the most important moments of his career. That evening, Judge Harrington sat in his living room, his usual routine of watching the evening news suddenly taking an uncomfortable turn. His wife Susan sat beside him, her hand frozen midway to her mouth with a cookie as Sarah Mitchell's face appeared on their TV screen. "Our top story tonight," the news anchor announced, "concerns a controversial decision at the Boston Municipal Court. Sarah Mitchell, One of the nation's most respected civil rights lawyers was fined $5,000 this morning for organizing a protest to protect homeless veterans. The judge felt his throat go dry as the screen showed footage from outside the courthouse. Sarah Mitchell stood surrounded by reporters, but unlike many people who received court fines, she wasn't angry or defensive. While I respect the court's authority, Sarah spoke calmly into the microphones. I believe this case highlights a bigger issue. 57 veterans who served our country are about to lose their homes. They filed all the proper paperwork for the protest, but somewhere in the system, it was lost. Susan turned to look at her husband, her eyes wide. Will, did she try to tell you about the permit? Judge Harrington couldn't answer. He remembered how he had cut Sarah off, not once but twice, when she had attempted to explain. The TV continued its report, showing images that made his heart sink further. Ms. Mitchell provided our station with a copy of the protest permit application, submitted 3 weeks ago, the reporter continued. City Hall has confirmed that due to a computer system error, the application was misplaced. Sources say this information was not presented in court because the judge did not allow Ms. Mitchell to complete her explanation. The scene changed to show elderly veterans outside the Wilson building. One man, wearing a faded Marine Corps cap, spoke with tears in his eyes. Ms. Mitchell is the only lawyer who agreed to help us without charging a fee. She's been fighting for us for months. When they wouldn't listen to our legal arguments, she stood with us on the street. Now they're punishing her for protecting people who protected this country. Judge Harrington's phone kept buzzing with messages. His daughter Rachel had sent more links. Articles about Sarah Mitchell's work with refugee children, her successful arguments before the Supreme Court, her recent selection for the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Each new piece of information felt like another weight on his conscience. The TV showed more footage from the actual protest. Contrary to the police report he had relied on, the video clearly showed protesters staying on the sidewalk, only briefly stepping into the street to allow elderly veterans with wheelchairs to pass. Traffic had slowed, but wasn't completely blocked as the report had claimed. Will, Susan said softly, isn't this the kind of case your father would have supported? The mention of his father made Judge Harrington's chest tighten. Robert Harrington had passed away 5 years ago, but his words still echoed in his son's memory. The law without compassion is just words on paper, Billy. Remember that. The news segment ended with a powerful image. Sarah Mitchell helping an elderly veteran in a wheelchair up a courthouse ramp, while carrying a stack of legal documents. The caption read, Mitchell has won 7 major veterans' rights cases in the past year alone. Just then, his phone rang. It was Judge Martinez, his mentor from his early days as a lawyer. William, tell me you've seen the news. I'm watching it now, sir, Judge Harrington replied, his voice heavy. You know what you need to do, right? Judge Martinez's voice was kind but firm. This isn't just about a fine anymore. This is about showing that our justice system can acknowledge its mistakes. After hanging up, Judge Harrington walked to his home office and pulled out his father's old military photo. Robert Harrington stood proud in his Army uniform, a reminder of the values he had tried to instill in his son. Susan appeared in the doorway. What are you going to do? Judge Harrington picked up his phone and dialed Mary, his clerk. When she answered, his voice was clear and determined. Mary, first thing tomorrow morning, I want you to schedule a special hearing for the Sarah Mitchell case. And find out if any of those reporters are still at the courthouse. Tell them I have a statement to make. As he put down the phone, Judge Harrington knew that tomorrow would be one of the most important days of his career. It was time to show that true justice includes the ability to admit when you're wrong. Sleep refused to come to Judge Harrington that night. He tossed and turned in his bed while Susan slept peacefully beside him. At 2 a.m., he finally gave up and walked downstairs to his home office, turning on only his small desk lamp. Opening his laptop, he began doing something he had never done before, researching a case after making his decision. The more he read about Sarah Mitchell's work, the heavier his heart became. An old newspaper article showed her standing outside an orphanage in Haiti, where she had helped reunite separated immigrant families. Another photo captured her receiving an award from the American Bar Association for her work with homeless veterans. Each new discovery made his hasty judgment feel more shameful. He opened his email and found hundreds of messages from lawyers, veterans groups, and civil rights organizations. One email particularly caught his eye. It was from James Wilson, his old roommate from law school who now worked with veterans. Will, the email read, I've known Sarah Mitchell for years. She's helped more veterans than any lawyer I know. Last month, she spent her own money to pay rent for 3 elderly veterans who were about to be evicted. The protest wasn't about causing trouble. It was her last resort to protect people who had nowhere else to go. Judge Harrington rubbed his tired eyes, remembering how many times his own father had talked about fellow veterans living on the streets. He opened his father's old journal, which he kept in his desk drawer. One entry from 1985 stood out. Today I saw Tommy, who served with me in Vietnam, sleeping in the park. He fought for this country, but now the country has forgotten him. Someone needs to speak up for those who gave everything for our freedom. The judge's hands trembled slightly as he closed the journal. In his rush to maintain order in his courtroom, had he become exactly the kind of person his father had criticized? Someone who followed rules blindly without considering human dignity. At 3 a.m., he found himself watching videos of Sarah Mitchell's previous court appearances. Her arguments were always well prepared, respectful, and focused on protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. In one video, she spoke about growing up in a poor neighborhood where her mother worked 3 jobs to support the family. I became a lawyer, she said in the video, because I saw how the system often overlooked people who couldn't afford expensive attorneys. Justice shouldn't depend on your bank account or the color of your skin. Judge Harrington walked to his bathroom and stared at his reflection in the mirror. The face looking back at him seemed older, more troubled. Had he treated Sarah Mitchell differently because of unconscious bias? Would he have been so quick to dismiss her if she had been a white male lawyer in an expensive suit? These uncomfortable questions kept circling in his mind as he made himself a cup of coffee in the kitchen. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten when Susan found him sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by printouts of Sarah Mitchell's cases. You haven't slept at all, have you? She asked softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. How could I? He replied, his voice rough with exhaustion. I made a mistake, Susan. A big one. And not just about the facts of the case. I need to face some hard truths about myself. Susan sat down beside him, examining the papers spread across the table. Your father always said that the hardest judgments are the ones we make about ourselves. Judge Harrington nodded slowly. I prided myself on being strict but fair, but yesterday I was neither. I didn't even give her a chance to speak. What does that say about me? About my beliefs that I might not even have known I had. The morning sun was now streaming through the kitchen window. In a few hours, he would need to put on his robes and return to the courthouse, but this time he wouldn't be the same judge who had sat on that bench yesterday. I need to make this right, he said, standing up. Not just the fine, that's the easy part. I need to show that our justice system can learn and grow, that we can acknowledge our biases and work to overcome them. As he headed upstairs to prepare for what would surely be one of the most challenging days of his career, Judge Harrington finally felt clear about what he needed to do. Sometimes, he realized, the most important judgment a judge can make is about himself. The next morning, Judge Harrington arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. The sun had barely risen, but reporters were already gathering outside. He slipped in through the back entrance, noticing how different everything looked through his newly opened eyes. Mary, his clerk, was waiting in his chambers with a thick folder. Good morning, Your Honor. I gathered everything about Sarah Mitchell's legal career and the Veterans Shelter case as you requested. The judge settled behind his desk, his usual morning coffee untouched. What did you find about the protest permit, Mary? It's quite interesting, sir, Mary began, pulling out several documents. The veterans group submitted their permit application 3 weeks ago. I spoke with City Hall this morning. They found the original application stuck in their system due to a computer glitch. They're taking full responsibility for the error. Judge Harrington picked up the first document, a detailed plan for a peaceful protest, properly filled out and signed. The second paper was even more revealing, a list of Sarah Mitchell's pro bono cases over the past year. She had spent over 1,000 hours helping veterans, elderly people, and homeless families without charging a penny. There's more, Mary continued, her voice softer now. I spoke with Officer Jenkins, who was at the protest. He admits the police report was exaggerated. The traffic wasn't blocked for 30 minutes. It was barely 10 minutes, and that was only because they were helping two elderly veterans in wheelchairs cross the street. The judge closed his eyes for a moment, remembering how quickly he had accepted the police report without question. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Rachel, his daughter, still in her law school sweatshirt. "Dad," she said, walking in with her laptop, "you need to see this. My professor just showed us Sarah Mitchell's latest case in class. She's been working on saving the veterans shelter for 6 months. She filed every possible legal motion, attended every city council meeting, and even offered to help find new investors to buy the building." Judge Harrington watched the video Rachel showed him. It was security camera footage from the protest, showing Sarah Mitchell helping elderly veterans stand in an orderly line, making sure nobody blocked traffic. She had even brought water and chairs for those who couldn't stand for long. "Your Honor," Mary interrupted gently, "Mr. Peterson from the Veterans Affairs Office is here. He says he has important information about the shelter case." Mr. Peterson, a gray-haired man in a neat but worn suit, entered the chamber. "Judge Harrington, I needed to tell you this in person. Sarah Mitchell has been using her own money to pay for hotel rooms for some of our most vulnerable veterans since the shelter received its eviction notice. She didn't want anyone to know. We only found out when one of the hotel managers mentioned it." The judge sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by all this new information. Everything he had assumed about the case had been wrong. Sarah Mitchell wasn't a troublemaker. She was exactly the kind of lawyer the justice system needed more of. His phone buzzed with a message from Judge Martinez. "William, I just heard from the Supreme Court clerk. Sarah Mitchell is scheduled to argue a major veterans' rights case next month. Your fine could affect her standing with the Bar Association. Time is crucial." Rachel, who had been quietly reading through the documents on his desk, looked up. "Dad, do you remember what you always told me about justice? That it's not just about following the law, but about making sure the law serves its true purpose?" Judge Harrington nodded slowly, remembering all the times he had given that speech to his daughter. Now it was time to live up to his own words. "Mary," he said, standing up with newfound determination, "call Ms. Mitchell's office. I want to schedule a special hearing for this afternoon, and contact the media. They should hear what I have to say." As his chamber began buzzing with activity, Judge Harrington looked at the photo of his father on his desk. "You were right, Dad," he whispered. "Sometimes the bravest thing a judge can do is admit he was wrong." The morning sun now filled his chamber completely, and with it came a clarity he hadn't felt in years. Today wouldn't just be about correcting a legal mistake, it would be about showing that true justice requires both wisdom and humility. By noon, courtroom 302 was packed with people. Reporters filled the back rows, their cameras ready. Veterans in their military caps sat in the middle, some in wheelchairs, others standing proudly despite their age. Law students from nearby universities lined the walls, notebooks in hand. Judge Harrington stood in his chambers, adjusting his robes one last time. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up his father's old military pin, which he had brought from home. For the first time in his career, he pinned it to his robe, a small reminder of what real justice meant. "The press is asking if this is about the fine, Your Honor," Mary said, poking her head in. "They want to know if you're just doing this because of the media attention." The judge shook his head. "This is about much more than a fine, Mary. This is about addressing something deeper in our justice system, and in myself." At exactly 1 p.m., the court officer's voice rang out. "All rise. The Honorable Judge William Harrington presiding." The room fell silent as the judge walked to his bench. Sarah Mitchell sat at the defendant's table, still carrying herself with the same dignity she had shown the day before. This time, though, Judge Harrington noticed details he had missed yesterday: the simple wedding ring on her finger, the tired lines around her eyes that spoke of long nights working on cases, the worn briefcase that had probably seen hundreds of courtrooms. "Before we begin," Judge Harrington spoke, his voice carrying through the hushed courtroom, "I want to address something important. Yesterday, in this very courtroom, I made a serious error, not just in my judgment, but in my fundamental duty as a judge." He paused, looking directly at Sarah Mitchell. "Ms. Mitchell, I failed to give you the basic right that every person deserves in a courtroom, the right to be heard. My rush to judgment, my assumptions, and yes, my own unexamined biases led me to make a decision that was neither just nor fair." Murmurs filled the courtroom. A few reporters started scribbling frantically in their notebooks. Judge Harrington continued, his voice growing stronger. This morning, I learned some things that every judge should have known before making a decision. I learned that you submitted a proper protest permit that was lost due to a computer error. I learned that the protest lasted only 10 minutes, not 30 as reported. But most importantly, I learned about who you are and what you stand for. He picked up a paper from his bench. You've spent thousands of hours helping veterans without charging a penny. You've used your own money to house homeless veterans. You've argued before the Supreme Court for people who couldn't afford lawyers. And yesterday, when I fined you unfairly, you responded not with anger, but with dignity. Sarah Mitchell sat quietly, her eyes fixed on the judge. In the gallery, several veterans wiped tears from their eyes. The fine I imposed yesterday is hereby vacated, Judge Harrington announced. But that's not enough. As a judge, I need to do more than just correct a single mistake. I need to address the system that allowed this mistake to happen. He cleared his throat, feeling the weight of every word. Therefore, I am establishing a new procedure in this court. Before any protest-related cases are decided, we will require a thorough review of all permit applications, including those that might have been lost in the system. Additionally, I am recommending mandatory bias training for all court personnel, including myself. The courtroom erupted in applause, which the court officer quickly silenced. Judge Harrington held up his hand. Ms. Mitchell, would you please approach the bench? Sarah stood and walked forward, her steps steady and dignified. When she reached the bench, the judge did something unprecedented. He stood up and stepped down from his platform to meet her at eye level. On behalf of this court, and personally, I apologize, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Your work reminds us what the law is supposed to do: protect those who need protection, speak for those who need a voice, and ensure that justice is truly just. As Sarah Mitchell nodded in acceptance, Judge Harrington touched his father's military pin. Sometimes, he realized, the greatest victories in a courtroom aren't about winning cases, they're about winning back our own humanity. The news of Judge Harrington's public apology and policy changes spread quickly across the city. By evening, every major news channel was covering the story, but something even more remarkable was happening in the courthouse's main conference room. After the hearing, Sarah Mitchell had approached Judge Harrington with an unexpected proposal. Your Honor, she had said, instead of just making this about one case, why don't we work together to create real change? Now, 2 hours later, the conference room was filled with an unusual group. Judge Harrington, Sarah Mitchell, 5 other judges from different courts, veterans representatives, and city officials. Papers covered the long wooden table as they discussed ways to prevent similar incidents in the future. The problem isn't just lost permit applications, Sarah explained, standing at the whiteboard where she had written key points. It's about how the system treats vulnerable people who can't always follow the usual procedures. Judge Harrington watched her in amazement. Instead of celebrating her victory or holding on to anger about his mistake, she was already working to turn this incident into something positive. Ms. Mitchell is right, he added, addressing his fellow judges. Today I learned that sometimes strictly following rules can actually prevent justice. We need a better system. One of the veterans, an elderly man named Tom Wilson, spoke up from his wheelchair. Last month, I tried to file a housing complaint. The clerk sent me to 4 different offices because I couldn't fill out the forms properly with my shaking hands. If Ms. Mitchell hadn't found me sitting in the hallway crying, I might have given up. The room fell silent. A young city official, who had been quietly taking notes, raised her hand. What if we created a special assistance desk? Someone to help people navigate the system, especially veterans and elderly citizens? Sarah's face lit up. That's exactly what we need. And it shouldn't just be for veterans. Many people struggle with court procedures: single parents who can't take time off work, people who can't afford lawyers, elderly people who can't stand in long lines. Judge Harrington stood up and walked to the whiteboard. Under Sarah's points, he began writing new policies. Flexible hearing hours for working people. Mobile court services for disabled veterans. Training for court staff about bias and sensitivity. Regular review of all court procedures to ensure fairness. I have another suggestion, Sarah said, pulling out her laptop. I've been working on a program where law students provide free help to people navigating the court system. If we could make this official. Judge Martinez, who had joined the meeting, nodded enthusiastically. We could give law students course credit for helping people with court procedures. It would teach them compassion along with law. As the discussion continued, Judge Harrington noticed something remarkable. The walls that usually existed between judges, lawyers, and citizens seemed to be breaking down. Everyone was working together, sharing ideas and experiences. Near the end of the meeting, Sarah's phone buzzed. She looked at it and smiled. The city council just voted. They're stopping the shelter evictions and giving us 60 days to find a solution. The veterans in the room burst into applause. Judge Harrington felt a lump in his throat as he watched their relieved faces. There's one more thing, he said, standing up. I want to establish a monthly meeting like this one. We'll call it the Justice Access Committee. Ms. Mitchell, would you co-chair it with me? Sarah looked surprised but pleased. I would be honored, Your Honor, but only if we ensure that people from all communities have a voice in these meetings. As people began gathering their things to leave, Judge Harrington's daughter Rachel, who had been sitting quietly in the corner taking notes, approached her father. Dad, she said softly, remember how you always told me that true justice is about more than just following laws. Today you showed me what that really means. The judge looked around the room, at Sarah organizing the next steps with city officials, at veterans sharing their stories with attentive listeners, at his fellow judges discussing ways to make their courtrooms more accessible. His mistake, which had seemed so terrible this morning, had somehow opened the door to something powerful. It wasn't just about correcting one wrong decision anymore. It was about creating a justice system that truly served everyone. As the evening sun cast long shadows through the conference room windows, Judge Harrington realized that sometimes the greatest changes come from our biggest mistakes if we have the courage to learn from them. 6 months later, courtroom 302 looked very different from that fateful morning when Sarah Mitchell had first stood before Judge Harrington. A new assistant's desk stood near the entrance, staffed by law students wearing court helper badges. The walls displayed clear signs in multiple languages, and a ramp had been installed for easier wheelchair access. On this particular morning, Judge Harrington sat in his regular chair, but something about him had changed. The stern expression was replaced by an attentive, patient look. His father's military pin, now a permanent feature on his robe, caught the morning sunlight. Today marks 6 months since our Justice Access program began, he announced to the packed courtroom. We're here to review its impact and celebrate some remarkable changes. Sarah Mitchell stood at the podium, no longer as a defendant but as a partner in change. She held up a thick report. In the past 6 months, she began, we've helped over 2,000 people navigate the court system. The Veterans Shelter not only stayed open, but has expanded to help 50 more veterans. Our law student volunteer program now has participants from 3 universities. From the gallery, Tom Wilson, the veteran who had once cried in the courthouse hallway, raised his hand. Judge Harrington nodded for him to speak. 6 months ago, I was about to lose my home, Tom said, his voice strong. Today, I'm helping other veterans learn their rights, and I don't have to worry about shaky hands when filling out forms. These young law students are always there to help. Rachel, who had graduated from law school and now worked with the program, stepped forward with more updates. Our evening court sessions have helped hundreds of working parents access legal services. The mobile court unit has visited 30 senior centers. And most importantly, not a single protest permit has been lost since we updated the system. Judge Martinez, sitting in the gallery, smiled proudly. The program had spread to other courthouses in the city, with more judges requesting training on bias awareness and accessible justice. But the numbers don't tell the whole story, Sarah continued. She gestured to a group of people standing near the back. These are our latest success stories. One by one, people came forward to share their experiences. An elderly woman who got help recovering her life savings from a scammer. A single father who finally got custody of his children. A young veteran who found both housing and a job through the program. Judge Harrington listened to each story, remembering how close he had come to missing this opportunity for change. His hasty judgment of Sarah Mitchell could have remained just another example of bias in the system. Instead, it had become a catalyst for transformation. There's one more announcement, Sarah said, smiling. The American Bar Association has chosen our program as a national model. Starting next month, Judges and lawyers from across the country will visit to learn how to implement similar changes in their courts. The room burst into applause. Judge Harrington stood up, waiting for quiet. 6 months ago, I made a mistake that could have been just another sad story about bias and rushed judgment, he said. But thanks to Ms. Mitchell's grace and wisdom, it became something else, a chance to make real change. He touched his father's pin. My father used to say that true justice is like a garden. It needs constant attention, care, and most importantly, people willing to do the hard work of maintaining it. Today, I see that garden flourishing. Sarah Mitchell approached the bench, carrying something in her hands. The veterans wanted you to have this, Your Honor. It was a plaque that read, "To Judge William Harrington, for showing that justice is not just about being right, but about doing right." As the morning sun filled the courtroom, Judge Harrington looked at the faces before him. Sarah Mitchell, who had turned an injustice into inspiration, the law students, learning that law books aren't complete without compassion, the veterans, standing tall with restored dignity, his daughter Rachel, carrying on the work of justice in her own way. "Court is adjourned," he announced, his voice warm. "But our work continues." As people filed out of the courtroom, a young lawyer stopped to help an elderly man with his walker. A law student explained a form to a nervous-looking mother. A veteran shared his story with a reporter. This, Judge Harrington realized, was what justice really looked like. Not just laws and procedures, but people helping people, everyone deserving of dignity, every story worthy of being heard. What had begun with a mistake had grown into a movement, proving that sometimes the greatest victories come not from being perfect, but from learning to be better.